Hello and welcome again to the AIEA-sponsored series of interviews with leaders in the field of international education, both American and internationally, who have helped develop the field as the second generation of leaders after World War II. After World War II, a generation who retired in the late 1990s in the United States especially and elsewhere had brought international education to the level of becoming a globally identified mission in American higher education, but not always completely supported mission either. And it's been the second generation of leaders, now approaching retirement, who have tried to take that mission and mold it into a reality that works for students and faculty all over the world. Today, I'm really pleased to be interviewing Professor Nico Jooste, and I'm sure I'm not saying that perfectly correctly, who is, at this point in his career, the Senior Director for the Office of International Education at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, formerly Port Elizabeth University. And Nico has had a very expansive career in both development within South African higher education and contributing to interaction internationally and globally. And so I would like just to talk with Nico a little bit about his career and what he has done and how he got here, but I think I'm going to first ask him something he was talking about before we started, and that is the definition of internationalization itself, which is something that gets tossed around a lot, and lots of words get used interchangeably: globalization, internationalization. And I think it's an important way to start the conversation. So, Nico, welcome, and I would like to ask you what you think when you hear people like myself talk about the internationalization of higher education.
Although internationalization is seen to be a global activity, it does have particular regional impact, and it's impacted by its origins in a region. And therefore, my interpretation of internationalization is always seen from a developing, emerging world perspective. And what might be a priority for the developed world and the initial definition of internationalization, the Jane Knight definition,
right,
that focus on intercultural competencies and understanding, is a very relevant definition for its time. I think we've moved into a world where when globalization became the buzzword, and we all had the inclination to think that globalization will create the world that's flat.
Yes.
If we think of the world of today, it's not flat.
Right.
And thus, internationalization for myself from the developing world is how do we bring the benefits of the global and the local to those societies that are largely excluded from globalization itself. And in South Africa, we live in an environment where the inequalities that you see in the world is duplicated in a local environment. In
Right.
Port Elizabeth, you would have a first world part of the city and a poor, underdeveloped part of the city.
Yes.
And it plays out there. And the real question about internationalization is, how do we bring the benefits of internationalization to both those communities?
Right.
And connect them? Because whether we like it or not, and I think that's what my generation experienced, is that we're living in an interconnected world.
Right.
And we can't escape global influences. And in many cases, the negative part of global fallout affects the poor more than the rich.
Yes.
And therefore, internationalization, from my point of view, is how do we make sure that when this happens, we explain it and we make it a reality to those who wouldn't understand it. Because if we don't do that,
and make it a benefit to them as well.
Well, that's the one, but the other is, of course, then all the ugly negatives of society pops up.
Yes.
And South Africa have seen xenophobia jumping out every now and again. And it is not because the people are inherently bad. It's because they don't understand.
Yeah.
And it affects them.
Yeah.
And therefore the other becomes the enemy.
You know, what you're saying is equally relevant to the United States. And
sure.
I mean, this is 2016, and in the United States we're in the midst of a shocking and tumultuous political campaign. And it is, in many ways, the same audiences that you're discussing with the same lack of understanding and lack of support as they go through the process that impacts them.
Yeah. So, but one thing that I think we over time have discovered about internationalization, that it is an intentional activity. It doesn't just happen. There needs to be intentionality.
And it's different from globalization.
Oh, yeah.
Globalization is the process. Internationalization is the thought.
No, they're absolutely there. The two, a good friend of mine in South Africa have always said that internationalization isn't intensified globalization. It's two separate processes.
I agree.
They feed on each other, but they can actually exist without the one without the other.
Right, right. Well, you have devoted a career to this, and I want to come back full circle as we go through this interview to the things you see you're doing now and in the future. I would like to begin, because we're also doing this for historical documentation, at the beginning of your career. When you and I began in this field, there was no such thing as a profession of international education.
No.
So how did you get involved with this, and where did you get involved with this, and what was it like there in South Africa and also globally when you became involved, if there was a global?
What makes it interesting from a South African point of view is up to 1994, which actually up to 1989, 1990, South Africa was isolated from the world. And the cultural and academic boycott didn't allow interaction between South African universities and the rest of the world. So during that period, I was a faculty in American term. I'm an historian, and part of my area of interest is the South Africa and the Cold War, and therefore the whole notion of the global and the international and its influence on the local has been very, in my field of study, has been there. And when internationalization started to, or when the world opened up for South Africa, I was in a different position at the university that's celebrating this year its 100th birthday at the University of Fort Hare. I was the equivalent of the provost at the university. And it was the beginning of international links, and I actually worked very closely with ACE.
Oh, really?
And we developed, through ACE, a strategic refocusing of the University of Fort Hare. And my very first overseas visit was to the US.
May I ask you?
On ACE.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And
what year was that?
That was 1992, 93. And ACE had a number of senior fellows that promoted strategic planning. And I had the privilege to work with a man with the name of Bob Shirley from University of South Colorado in Puebla.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was my first visit. But in any case, and that's when I realized that international linkages between universities play an important role in development of those institutions that needs more development,
Right.
but also the academic connections bring new knowledge to each other. And it's University of South Colorado in Puebla had a very, I'm sure I still have, a very strong program in criminology.
Really?
Because they close to one of those jails in the up where no one can escape from.
Yeah.
And we had a very strong criminology department at Fort Hare University. And the criminologists started working together and sharing information. And that was the first time that I realized that global knowledge needs to connect.
Right. And that was
Because-
very unusual.
Yeah, but because in isolation, you actually start focusing so much on yourself that you reach a ceiling and a limit in knowledge development.
Right.
Whilst if you do it across cultures, borders, historical lines, it actually opens up.
Yeah.
And the other, why I became an advocate of internationalization was South Africa, as I said, was very isolated. And we didn't get all the literature and books that was necessary. And what we had was always a bit skewed.
Yeah.
So it was only until 1991 that I realized, remember there was no TV and internet, there was TVs but not internet. Well, TV came late to South Africa in 1976 only.
Yeah.
But that I realized that Jim Crow and apartheid were brothers.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
And as an historian, I should have known.
Yeah.
And in the literature that we had, there was very, very little about
Of
it.
course. Of course. Yeah.
And that triggered the whole interest for me
Right.
in how do we open up this world for each
That's a
other.
perfect example of not knowing something that one almost takes for granted knowing.
Mhm. Today, I mean, if I say that, people will say, what?
That's so interesting. So that meant you found yourself then in a South African university with an awareness of what needed to get done. How do you do something?
Well, Fort Hare had status in South Africa. It was Mandela's university. It is the oldest historically black university in Southern Africa and East Africa, for that matter. And the world, after '94, the world came to South Africa.
Yeah.
And the whole period of higher education tourism started. And we met
Higher education tourism. That's
people saw South Africa as something that they need to visit, and there wasn't any other reason. But you know, they were isolated from South Africa, and we had hundreds of delegations just coming
to really learn.
Well,
To
I wouldn't
see,
say learn, but to see. Eh? Sometimes it felt
it's
like,
also interesting.
sometimes
And these were faculty delegations.
faculty, university
Yeah.
presidents.
Yeah.
You know, we felt like sometimes I did say, well, we're not a zoo that you can come and look and then go away.
Yeah.
If you want to come to us, tell me why. And so we soon developed a little questionnaire. If you want to visit us, tell us the purpose. Who do you want to meet with, and so forth. And if you can't give it to us, then you're welcome. You're welcome to drive past, but because it became quite a burden on the universities, because you now had to host them and feed them, and
So it's financial burden for institutions that actually didn't have the finances to be burdened.
and when I wasn't used to this,
Yeah.
because that never happened.
Yeah.
Anyway, so and then I left Fort Hare in 1996 and started, or became the executive director of the Eastern Cape Higher Education Association. There were 8 universities in the Eastern Cape, and it was a consortium of universities. And one of the goals of the association was to enhance collaboration. And I used that opportunity to also look at similar organizations elsewhere.
Right.
And the organization that caught my eye, and I then came and visited on Ford Foundation funded travel, was the 5 colleges in corporate that was in Amherst.
Oh, yes, of course. That's interesting. And why was that the one that caught your interest?
Because it was a unique way of collaboration.
Yeah.
It was 4 institutions that created this 5th one,
Right.
where they collaborated to make it work.
Yeah.
If they, and it was because they didn't have enough funding, or there wasn't enough interest to make it work at all 4, like astronomy. So they created a program in the 5th college,
Yeah.
which belonged to all of them, and they shared the cost. And I thought that was a very interesting way to look at future global collaboration. How can we do that in a way that a university in South Africa, a university in China, India, the US, we collaborate and actually create a separate entity which belongs to all.
Right.
It's not there yet. That's why I'm sometimes critical to transnational education, where institutions go and set up a campus elsewhere,
Overseas, yeah.
instead of using the whole notion of collaboration.
Yeah.
But that's how I got into it, and then the University of Port Elizabeth in the early 2000s decided that they want to become a global, well-known global university, known globally.
Right.
And I got the first. That was the first university, well, not the first university, but it was one of those first ones in South Africa that intentionally started internationalization.
Yeah.
And that's where my role in this position started. I was quite fortunate, because by then, internationalization in different formats existed in Europe, existed in Australia, in the US, in the UK, etc. And as an academic, I then started to read about what's happening elsewhere.
Yes.
And I could look at what worked and what didn't work, and at that time, what was those issues that people would say, don't do it that way.
Right.
So, because we had no tradition of internationalization at UPE, I could actually develop a internationalization brand or strand,
Right.
if you want to call it that way, that built on the best practices that existed at that time.
Yeah.
And that's
Was
how
the
I started.
university supportive?
Very much so.
And why?
Well,
Because that doesn't always happen.
no, and that's why, if you ask me why am I, sometimes we're used as an example of internationalization in South Africa, the vision of the university in 2000, our university structure, the governance structure is you have a council, in your case it would be a board of governors, a council, and then the vice chancellor or president and senate, who are and our Senate is different from the American Senate.
Okay.
The Senate is the highest academic decision-making body at the university. They decided that it was important to start internationalization. I came in from the outside.
Were they faculty? The
They
Senate?
were faculty, but also the senior management of the university.
Okay.
And then the council is external and internal people.
Okay.
So, their vision was to see the University of Port Elizabeth becoming a globally positioned institution.
Right.
And they gave me all the support, and to a certain extent, their knowledge of internationalization was as limited, well, perhaps more limited than mine.
Right.
So from the beginning, I could set the agenda
Right.
of internationalization, which with hindsight, I was really privileged.
Yeah.
And the presidents, I've now had three, all three of them have been hugely supportive of internationalization.
Wow.
And you know, a while ago, I wrote a little article about the success of our international, and that to me is one of the critical success factors.
Yeah.
That senior leadership understood the value and didn't interfere. Of course, they helped in developing the direction and the strategies around it. But in the micro management of it, they left it, and that gave, that provided me with the incentives and the innovation space, innovative space to do internationalization. Yeah.
Well, can I ask you, what were the parts of internationalization? What were the component parts?
Interesting.
For your institutions.
Interesting. The latest buzzword in internationalization is comprehensive internationalization.
Yeah, right.
Now,
I like that you use the term latest buzzword too.
Now, in 2003-04, a dear friend of mine, Madeline Green,
Yes.
from ACE,
Yes.
she worked with me at Fort Hare, and I met her again, and she was then at ACE also doing international.
Right.
And she used the word comprehensive internationalization in 2003.
Yeah.
And we engaged around that. So for me, comprehensive internationalization means you internationalize the being of the institution,
Yeah.
its whole fabric. And if you go and look at our documents that we developed already in 2002, it was in there that for us to make internationalization work, we need to internationalize every aspect of the university. How the students, international students, are treated in the residences, at the finance department. How internationalized is the mindset of our faculty to look at the curriculum. And then also, how do we bring the benefits to the local? Not only where the university is situated, but the local in the region. So from day one, that's what we made our goal.
Right.
And we set some targets, benchmarks on how do we measure ourselves, whether we reach some of the benchmarks we set.
Right, right. So you looked at every piece of an institution, which it's something, for example, in the United States, 3% of American undergraduates go abroad, which means 97% don't. And one of the things I've always had a strong interest in is how do you internationalize that 97%?
Exactly.
So you started quite some time ago thinking about those kinds of questions.
Yes, because you see, in an environment where 70% of your students are disadvantaged, that wouldn't have the means to travel, even if you give them a ticket for free and waive the fees on the other side, they still wouldn't be able to live.
Right.
How do you make sure that when they graduate, they're globally competent? Because the employers that will employ them in our city are multinationals. In Port Elizabeth, you have Volkswagen, General Motors, Coca-Cola, you name them.
Yeah.
So if we don't bring the benefits of internationalization to them, they will not make it, and thus won't get employed.
Right.
I engage with employers to ask them what are those elements of the being of a student that you want us to instill.
Right.
And a lot of that had to do with how do they network, how do they understand the world, and it wasn't the more technical stuff on how to do accounting in Brazil.
Right.
That wasn't the issue, because the accounting firms, PwC and KPMG, they said that we do in any case.
Right.
But those other issues.
Right. How do you understand what you're living in Brazil?
Well, that is the one. The other is how do you how do you socialize with the other?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so that became part of our internationalization at home
Right.
drive,
Right.
and focusing a lot on the social competencies of students.
Right. Both, and so that would be both in terms of curriculum development,
Yeah.
extracurricular
Yeah,
activities on your
yeah.
campuses, opportunities for students who could to go abroad, faculty exchanges,
Yes.
faculty
Yes.
development,
Yes, all
and
of that.
staff development.
Stop with that. We did that. We actually established with one of our very good partner institutions in the US, St. Cloud State University, a staff mobility program where every November we go with 10, 12 staff for 2 weeks.
Right.
And they spend time at St. Cloud, and St. Cloud comes to us
Yeah.
in March every year for 2 weeks with their faculty,
Wonderful.
and out of that developed a long-standing relationship. Of course, we have similar relationships in Europe, but for South Africa it was also important to expand our footprint into the developing world, and especially in Africa.
Yeah.
And that, because the majority of our international students are from other
From
parts
other
of Africa.
Yes.
So when an American student comes to South Africa for 6 months study abroad, they actually meet Africa.
Yeah.
We have Kenyans, Nigerians, Zimbabweans, Botswana students, Mozambique, they're all there.
Right.
And that became one of the attractions of our campus and some of the other South African campuses, that you can meet Africa in
Right.
South Africa. And it prepared our students to really go and work in Africa.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the whole notion of comprehensive internationalization, some of the companies, like Coca-Cola for that matter, and I'm using them as an example because the headquarters of Coca-Cola Africa was in Port Elizabeth.
Ah, yes.
So they opened up a few new plants in East Africa. And they found that graduates from our university, who are from Uganda,
Right.
or Kenya for that matter, and then go back and work there, could immediately straddle between the local and the global.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the beauty of internationalization. If we focus on that, how do we, and then build those links,
Right.
go and establish them in Kenya, a university alumni chapter,
Right.
and because it enriched everybody.
Right.
So internationalization, as far as, to me, that's the core of what we should do. You know, at the conference here, we're having a paper tomorrow on commercialization and internationalization,
Mhm.
and the negatives of commercialization if we're not careful
Of international education itself.
on international
Yeah.
education. And my sincere what is the right word? I don't want to sound negative. For future development of internationalization, I think higher education in international, senior international officers for that matter, need to be very careful in analyzing the unintended outcomes of some of the activities that we are driving in today's international world, where it seemed to be purely for economic gain and not
Right.
for internationalizing the institution.
Right.
They're not mutually exclusive. That means if you go and recruit international students to come to your campus, that's perfect, because no campus can be internationalized without students.
Right. Right.
But it is what you do thereafter.
Right. That matters.
If you just bring them in and then leave them, then you're actually not internationalizing. We
Yeah.
just commercialized. That's A. B is, and one of the dangers is that if we only have international students from one part of the world on your campus,
Right.
then you haven't really internationalized.
And that actually leads me to another question I wanted to ask, and that is, because you're talking about an issue now, you were talking about an issue 20 years ago. What has that trajectory of change been within your own country and within Africa? How is it different now? What has
Well,
happened? How has it developed?
What has happened in South Africa to a large extent, because of the level of conflict and to a large extent poverty on the continent, the type of student is changing. That South Africa do house a large number of refugees,
Yes.
and we've been struggling with refugees longer than Europe has.
Yeah.
And how do you give them access? Because in an environment, South Africa, and for that matter other parts of Africa too, I assume, where the capacity to absorb the other isn't that great.
Yeah.
We don't have thousands of seats empty. You need to make a choice sometimes between an international and a local. And if you choose the international, you need to be clear to the local why it is that you have. So for us in South Africa, the change of the environment comes around that. Initially, students came to South Africa because from other parts of Africa only when they wanted to study.
Right.
That means they applied when they were outside and they came in.
Right.
A lot of universities are now sitting with people that are within South Africa, but they're still international.
Right.
That means they're not local. That's the one. The other is that...
There's huge numbers.
Yeah, there's large numbers. And the other is, of course, that where I think the positive part is that South Africa is an inexpensive environment compared to the US, the UK,
Yeah.
Europe. And therefore, there's a large demand developing around graduate work. And we have still a lot of capacity around to absorb graduate students, masters and PhDs. That's A. B is, we are now becoming one of those knowledge hubs in Africa, where we can actually have research and academic work done on those big issues that's affecting Africa and the world in South Africa.
Right.
And interesting enough, a lot of those PhDs, when they finished, they go back to their countries of origin and they continue with the work that they started with us.
Yeah.
So if you analyze the student data, since '94, we've had about 7% of the student population international. And it's an interesting graph. The international students stayed at 7%, although the numbers went up, because the capacity of South African numbers has also increased. But we've remained at 7%. But if you analyze that 7%, the last 4 or 5 years, the number of undergraduate students have actually declined and the graduate students have
Have
increased.
gone up. Oh, that's really interesting.
Because the real demand for from a South African point of view for places is at the undergraduate level and not at the graduate.
Right.
But so I do believe that if I analyze what's happening in South Africa, the knowledge that we're creating has become much more regional and African than South African.
Yeah.
And the link between the regional, African and global is becoming a real driver of the new knowledge creation. So,
Yeah. So that is a huge development in a relatively short period
It
of
is.
time historically.
It's it's 20 to 25 years.
Yeah, yeah, it's astonishing. And of course, accompanied with so much of the technological change.
Yeah.
And the internet and the
Yeah.
media that is available for this.
One of the other celebrations of internationalization is the number of international institutional partnerships that local universities have developed with universities from all over the world.
Yeah.
From Japan right through to Brazil, Argentina, the US, Canada, etc. So
So there's
I
a
think
real vibrance.
there is a real celebration of our international connections. But one thing I need to say, government played virtually no role in it.
That's interesting too.
Because its focus was not on that.
Right.
There were other issues that they had to look at. Universities and the organization that universities created, the International Education Association of South Africa, was and still is the main driver behind internationalization of South African higher education. Funding-wise, capacity-wise, etc. So we could do it in our own way,
Yeah.
without being told how to do it.
Yeah.
And I do believe the reason why we were so successful is because of that.
So you built in structure from the grassroots,
Yes.
not dropped it in
From-
externally.
Yes. And universities had to develop their own ways of doing it. Therefore, you wouldn't find a common internationalization platform
Right.
operating at all. They all basically do the same, but each institution have their own characteristics around internationalization.
If you're talking about the combination of the global and the local, there may not be any better way
Yes,
to develop this.
No, you're right.
Actually.
You're right.
I do wanted to ask you about associations. I know you were instrumental in developing the AIESA,
Yeah.
if I'm saying it correctly. We are at AIEA, you've certainly been active internationally. Have associations been a helpful role?
Yeah.
Do they play a helpful role?
We're actually writing a little book on.
Yeah,
on
who is we?
Well, I've developed a research unit, and AIESA will be 20 years old.
Yes,
We're
yes.
celebrating 20 years in January next year, and
I
as
should come to South
part of
Africa.
that, we're publishing the book on the role of national associations in internationalization.
Ah,
And I believe
that's great.
I believe national associations have played a critical role.
Uh-huh.
Right from the beginning. Even the European Association, which is not a national association, but they played that role in Europe. It's 25 years old.
Yes.
The European
Yes, I know quite
Association.
well, the AIEA.
Yeah. I don't think without associations there would have been this coherent drive towards a particular way of internationalization.
Certainly AIEA has been very active.
Very much so, but then also I think the role of associations is that they play the role of self-evaluation
Yeah.
a lot, where they, you know, higher education is a place where people always are critical about each other,
Yeah,
which is good. Now associations are not less critical.
yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, that's probably the unintended outcome
That's really
of
interesting.
associations, that
Yeah.
there's a constant rethinking and a critical mindset. And we're going
Which
through...
adjusts change,
Yes.
to change.
And we're going through that now again.
Yeah,
You know, AIESA, for whatever reason, we had this so-called global dialogue in 2014 on the future of internationalization, where all the associations came to Port Elizabeth, South Africa. And it was to me an eye-opener that the big ones, the NAFSAs, the AIE, the EIE, the Australians, they all came
yeah,
and had one common point of departure, and that's where are we going. And we are not happy with where we are.
Yeah.
We need to re-look and then define where we're going.
Right.
So coming back to the role of associations, I think it's critical. Without associations, I don't think internationalization would have been where it is.
And actually, your comments lead me to the last thing I wanted to talk about, and that is, where are we? What are you dissatisfied, and where are we going? What came out of that conference of associations? Why were they upset with where they were?
I think the big issue is that the focus of internationalization has become very technocratic. The focus in many cases is on how do you internationalize the curriculum, how many students do you send, what's the competencies that you need, and those questions about the big issues in the world, which lies at the heart of internationalization.
Don't get asked.
No, they don't.
Yeah,
You know,
that's really interesting.
the whole question about inequality, the whole question about conflict and migration, public health, we don't ask those questions enough.
Right.
You know, if you look at the topics of conferences, this one and others, they are embedded in those topics are the big questions. But if you analyze the papers that's delivered, it's the fallback is the how do we do?
Right, right. That's
And
interesting.
I don't think we ask enough and pay enough attention to the transformational issues.
Right.
And
how should we be doing that? How should we do
well, firstly, we universities,
Mhm.
and we operate as universities. So we should ask ourselves, in the process of internationalization, do we instill a ethical consciousness in our students
Mhm.
to always ask the right question? Because remember, all the disasters that have happened in the world over time, you go and look, the people that was part of that were graduates from universities, doesn't matter which one.
Yeah.
And so it's a very philosophical question. Have we as universities played the correct role
Yeah.
in changing the mindsets of people to become globally competent citizens? To understand if I do X, it does have an effect elsewhere. And I use this phrase a lot. Have we created, or do we understand that we actually operate in a global commons?
Yeah.
And that global commons belongs to all of us, and that when I enter that commons, what's the value that I take with me?
Mm-hmm.
And I use, when I describe my value, I talk about the South African or African value of Ubuntu.
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese have the same value. I am because of you. And therefore, if I enter this space, the first question I must ask is, my actions, how will it affect you? And I don't think we're at that
We're
stage.
not there, yeah.
And that, to me, that's critical that we move to there quickly.
Right.
Because the world is becoming a wild west at the moment.
Yeah.
And we must ask ourselves, how do we fix that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Because we do have a role to play.
Yeah.
We're probably the only ones that can play a real transformative role.
In changing understanding,
Because there's 4
knowledge,
million international
and value
students.
and perception, yeah.
I mean, there's 4 million people, 4.5 million people
Right.
moving as students.
Across the earth, right. So that, I think we conclude on a note that says that the work that has been done by people of this generation is very important work. It's not negligible work.
No, it's not. Definitely not, but it's not complete.
It is not complete. We could end with a newscast, and that would show that it is not
It's not
complete.
complete.
Do you have any particular goals in mind for your own remaining years in the field?
Yes, I do. I hope to be less operational and become a little bit more academic and transformational,
Yeah.
and and part of developing the new generation
Right.
of international educators.
Well, I think that is a perfect note to end on, and I know that I will certainly look forward to see the transformation that you continue to bring in South Africa and internationally. So I would like to thank Professor Nico Jooste for being a part of this series documenting the development of international education. Thank you.
Thank you very much.